Today, you are going to learn two advanced concepts in Next.js that I think are very important for professional Next.js developers to know. And if you stick around, I'm even going to throw in a bonus thing that is really important to look out for. There's going to be no errors thrown. It's going to be hard to know what's going on unless you stay tuned to this video. So first off, let's head over to VS Code. And what we're going to go over here is using server and client components. And the way that I have my project set up is this is our homepage. It is a server component because it does not have the use client directive here at the top of the page. It renders the client component here, this client container. If I go to that component, you can see it is a use client component. And then it just has a console log here at the top, basically console logging if it is either rendered or hydrated on the client. There's definitely some nuances there, but I'm not going to get into the specifics of client and server rendering here in this video. We're just going to cover a couple of advanced concepts related to it. So it's a client component. It renders some stuff. We also have this server info component. It's a server component. It has this server console.log and also renders some stuff. Less stuff, but still some stuff. So we render our client component and we also render our server component. Now, the very first concept that I think is important to understand, and it can be a little bit tricky if you haven't seen it before, is that you can pass data from server to client components. So our page component here, it is a server component. We have this array of data here, and we're passing that as a prop to our client component. This is 100% okay. And if we look at the application, you can see everything is rendered as we'd expect and everything looks good here. However, you can't pass all data from server to client components. The data needs to be serializable. If we go to the React docs here, you can see that serializable props are primitives, so strings, numbers, undefined, etc. Iterables containing serializable values, so strings, arrays, maps, sets, dates, promises. All of these are going to be serializable values that you can pass as props. Where you're going to run into problems is if you try to pass functions, classes, objects that are instances of classes, and symbols. So let's say I try to pass this symbol here to our client component from our server component, and I just paste it right here. And then we go back to our running application, and I see this big red error message that basically says only global symbols can be passed as props. It doesn't say it so clearly, but that's basically what it's saying here. Also, if I try to pass a function here, which is probably much more common, I can't say I've seen a ton of symbols in my day-to-day coding, but if we just pass a function that console logs some gibberish, we see that functions cannot be passed directly to client components unless you explicitly expose it as use server. So just like what I talked about, you cannot pass functions, classes, symbols. It must be a serializable type. And sometimes the error message is not super explicit of what's going on. It can be a little bit tricky to kind of figure out unless you know what's going on. So the first concept here is that it's totally fine to pass data from server to client components, and that in of itself isn't bad, but just remember that data must be serializable. Now, before I get to the second concept and the bonus tip here at the end, I do need to thank today's sponsor, Kind, the fully integrated developer platform, allowing you to implement modern auth, access management, as well as billing for engineers. On their billing product, they offer various billing tools, so you can start monetizing your ideas without really needing to build anything yourself and to be able to avoid hard coding that stuff, so you can actually focus on building more features rather than messing around with some of that not so fun stuff. They offer powerful provisioning features that are going to allow you to control how your customers access different parts of your app once they subscribe. So for example, maybe on your base plan, they can use a certain product up to 5 times, but then after that, they have to subscribe to a more premium plan. And they also supply webhooks, workflows, and different APIs. You can do it really in a wide variety of different tech stacks, and then also various different business models as well. Whether you're selling to individuals, startups, or global enterprises, Kind is really going to adapt to your business model. You can use their pricing table builder to build out some of these really nice looking tables, and you can provide your own HTML, JavaScript, and CSS to make it really fit in with your brand. You can integrate with Stripe in literally seconds on their platform with a very reasonable 0.5% transaction fee. Plus, you get free monthly active users when you use billing. So click the link below and $50 in kind credits to try this fully integrated developer platform. Not only can you pass data from server to client components, but you can also pass server components themselves as props or children to your client components. So here we have our client component, that's client container, but then as our header prop here, we're passing our server component. And then as children, we're also passing our server component. Now, this was a long time ago here at this point, but remember when I mentioned that in our client component, we have a console.log showing whether it's client or server, and same thing with our server and client? Well, this is where that's going to come into play here, because what you're going to see here is that our server component here and here are still going to be rendered on the server, even though you're passing them as props to your client component. And basically what React does here is like, hey, okay, we're just leaving a slot open in this client component for this server rendered component. And React is going to render this on the server and then do its thing with client components here. So if we come back to our running app, and I'm going to refresh for good measure here, you're going to see over here on the right-hand side, server info, it is rendering on the server, and you can see the content. Server info rendering on the server, hello from the children. And then our client component is hydrated on the client. So you can see we can pass server components as props to client components, and it's still going to render those server side, and this is totally valid to do. And not only that, you can pass it on the children prop as well. But now for the little kind of bonus gotcha when it comes to server and client components, what if we try to do something like within our client component, what if we try to render our server component directly? And I try to render server info, and then we add some info, and then maybe here we'll just say server or client rendered. And then you can see up at the top, I also imported server info. What you're going to see is that for our server info, that is server or client rendered here, it is actually rendering on the client. So let me refresh just so you can see them all again. So we have our hello from the header and our hello from the children. Both of those are still rendered on the server, which makes sense because our client component, we're just passing those as props to our client component on the children prop and then on the header prop. But here, our server info component that has server or client rendered as the info, that is rendered on the client. And the reason this is the case is because it's important to remember that when you define a use client within your application, you're defining a client boundary, meaning that anything that you import into your client component is going to be included in the client side bundle. So when we import the server info into our client component, we're going to include server info here in the client bundle. So when you have a use client, it's marking the boundary of where your client bundle is going to start. So anything imported into it and all children of that client component, not necessarily props, as we already saw, but all children, it's going to be included in our client bundle, which is why you're seeing it rendered client side. So in summary here, you can pass data from server to client components. And that's actually the recommended way to do your data fetching. Fetch your data in a server component and then pass it down into your client components. You just need to make sure that that data is serializable. Number two, it's totally okay for you to pass a server component to a client component as a prop or even on the children prop. So they can be passed as props or children, server components into client components. However, anytime you use client within your application, that is going to mark a client boundary, meaning that anything that is imported into that client component or anything that is rendered as a child of that client component is going to be included in the client bundle and is effectively going to be client rendered. So thank you so much for tuning in to this. Make sure to check out that $50 in free credits down below. If you have any questions about anything I covered today, make sure to let me know and I'll try to get right back to you. All right, see you in that next one.